Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. I'm Nathan Moore. I'm interested in epistemic injustice and philosophy of disability. I'm especially interested in barriers and injustices related to equal participation in the production and dissemination of knowledge, as well as the role of non-propositional knowledge in creating and maintaining epistemic barriers. I'm very excited to introduce our last speaker for the day, Maeve M. Maeve was a philosophy professor at Notre Dame of Maryland University until fairly recently, serving 8 of her 20 years there as department chair. She co-edited the 2014 anthology, Why Race and Gender Still Matter, an Intersectional Approach. She is currently a member of the American Philosophical Association's Committee on the Status of Disabled People in the Profession. Her talk today is on neurodiversity, neurotypicality, and philosophy. Welcome, Maeve, and thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. It was delightful to get to know you a little in email, and I hope to continue the conversation. And thank you, Shelley and Jonathan, for organizing this important conference. To describe myself visually, I am a white woman in her 50s with dark brown and gray curly hair, a round face, freckles, green eyes. I'm wearing a black shirt and a gray cardigan, and I have an opaque background up because I moved to a sort of loft studio apartment. So it's opaque, it's rose gold with faint gold circles. And I go by she, her. So, I'm here today to talk about philosophy and cognitive disability, an area of growing interest and importance in the field of philosophy. My primary interest is in cognitively disabled philosophers rather than those who are unlikely, if not unable, to become professional philosophers. Cognitive disability as a term can be a bit unhelpful given the number, heterogeneity, and range of severity of experiences that fall under the term. It includes what many call severe or profound intellectual disabilities, as well as what Americans refer to as specific learning disabilities, such as dyslexia. It also, at least in my usage, includes other disabilities known to impact perception and the processing of external stimuli, such as attention deficit disorder, autism, depression, and the like. So, as is typical for philosophers, I am speaking to you about a category that is and should remain problematic. That is why I titled my talk Neurodiversity, Neurotypicality, and Philosophy. Why am I narrowing my focus to cognitively disabled philosophers, you may wonder? There are a number of reasons. First, I identify as a cognitively disabled philosopher, and I'm convinced that my cognitive disabilities make me do philosophy differently. I believe this is more than likely the case for other cognitively disabled philosophers. Second, I will argue that these ways of philosophizing differently are vital to the field and its flourishing. Third, much of the conversation about cognitive disability and philosophy focuses on intellectual disabilities, what are termed learning disabilities in England, excuse me, and not cognitive disability among philosophy's ranks. This is by no means a failure. Intellectually disabled persons are mistreated and dehumanized in most cultures, and these harms are propped up by much of what moral philosophy has deemed necessary for personhood, agency, and autonomy. It is vital that philosophers challenge the systems of thinking justifying such harms. However, it does contribute to an ongoing belief that you can't be both cognitively disabled and a philosopher. As one such philosopher, among many, I want to bring attention to a different set of harms and issues that exist in the field. Fourth, and finally, I also do this in the name of the thousands of students I had the pleasure to work with over 20 years, many of whom were rightly afraid to disclose their cognitive disabilities or advocate for accommodations, given the dismissive or worse responses of their other professors. My work honors them. I begin with an overview of how cognitive disability has shown up in philosophy, followed by a brief discussion of the neurodiversity movement. Next, I talk about why cognitive diversity is vital to academia and philosophy, and provide some examples to support this claim. Lastly, I reflect on what comes next. The only slide I have is the slide you see in front of you, just to keep track of the sections of the paper. So first, important moments in the history of the philosophy of cognitive disability. Some of the earliest discussions of cognitive disability in philosophy were in philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind is primarily concerned with questions of mental content, thoughts, perceptions, sensations, feelings, and processes, and the relationship of this content to the body, the brain, and the subjective experience of consciousness. Once seen as occurring in an immaterial soul, the subjective experience of consciousness, also known as having mental states, is now understood to be material, at least insofar as it is dependent on the existence of physical matter, such as the brain. This physicalism has led many philosophers of mind to integrate neuroscience and cognitive psychology into the more traditional philosophical methods of introspection and logical argumentation. And it is in this emergent interdisciplinarity that we find discussion of learning disabilities, American version, and other so-called pathologies of the mind. Unlike in disability studies, where disabilities are studied to understand and better advocate for disabled persons, in philosophy of mind, disabilities are treated as opportunities to better understand the quote-unquote normal mind. To quote Gertler and Shapiro, the study of pathology is valuable in part for the light it sheds on how a normal brain might create a normal mind. That's from 2007. This perspective is common in the field's discussion of cognitive disabilities. I could give you citations if you'd like, and it's reflected in a relatively recent trend toward inclusion of sections on, again, the word is pathologies in various works. Another area of philosophy interested in cognitive disability is moral philosophy. The interest here is primarily, but not exclusively, with intellectual disabilities, defined as mental deficits that produce, quote, an impairment in everyday adaptive functioning, conceptual, social, or practical, end quote, relative to a peer group, and sufficient that ongoing support is needed for the person to perform adequately in one or more life settings. That's a recent September 2021 update to the DSM-5 from the American Psychiatric Association. The path-breaking 2008 conference, Cognitive Disability, A Challenge to Moral Philosophy, hosted by Eva Kate and Leisha Carlson, which has since been published as a book of the same title in 2010, not only shed light on just how deeply and problematically moral philosophers depend on the exclusion of the intellectually disabled to justify their claims, it also provided critical interventions and alternatives, many of which have since worked their way into the larger philosophical discourse. There is an important revisiting and reconceiving of philosophical conceptions of personhood, autonomy, and agency in the context of moral theories happening today. Indeed, this is perhaps the most established area of philosophy of cognitive disability, another example of which can be found in the 2020 Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Disability, edited by David Wasserman and Adam Curitan, which was also first presented as a conference in 2017. Philosophical work on cognitive disability is multiplying, and in my chapter for the book that this conference is leading up to, I will provide more detail on this. One of the most novel things to happen in recent years, from my perspective as a disabled philosopher, is the series of interviews with disabled philosophers conducted and published by Shelley Tremaine. These are available on our biopolitical philosophy website under the heading Dialogues on Disability. The interviewees do not always disclose their disabilities, but enough do to recognize that among them are cognitively disabled philosophers talking about being cognitively disabled philosophers. It is from those interviews that I will draw some of the examples that I use today. So that is an altogether inadequate introduction to philosophy and cognitive disability. Perhaps we can discuss this more in the question and answer session. Section 2. What are neurodiversity and neurotypicality? Returning to the title of my talk, I now want to explain the terms neurodiversity and neurotypicality and discuss their importance in philosophy. As a sign of just how successful the neurodiversity movement has been, I'm going to use a definition of the terms as provided on a job description generating company OnGig, definitions which are fairly succinct and clear. So, quote, neurodiversity is a relatively new term coined in 1998 by autistic Australian sociologist Judy Singer. The neurodiversity definition began as a way to describe people on the autistic spectrum. Neurodiversity has since broadened to include people with autism, dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, and other neurological differences. A person without the neurological differences above is called neurotypical. Here's a more complete definition. Neurotypical, often abbreviated as NT, means having a style of neurocognitive functioning that falls within the dominant social standards of normal. Neurotypical can be used either as an adjective or a noun. So those are our definitions. The neurodiversity movement is one that promotes the value and unique contributions of neurodiverse persons to society and argues for the inclusion of such persons in efforts to promote diversity in various contexts. My arguments for the inclusion of cognitively disabled philosophers as practitioners and as a topic in philosophy and in philosophy of disability aligns with this goal. While it has been years since I have been able to find it, there was once a great send-up of neurotypicals online from, quote, the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical, or ISNT, providing a diagnostic category for them regarding their disordered thinking about what is normal and explaining the probable causes of such disordered thinking. So I'm going to quote from that, from an old paper copy I had of it. Neurotypical syndrome is a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. Neurotypical individuals often assume that their experience of the world is either the only one or the only correct one. NTs find it difficult to be alone. NTs are often intolerant of seemingly minor differences in others. When in groups, NTs are socially and behaviorally rigid and frequently insist upon the performance of dysfunctional, destructive, and even impossible rituals as a way of maintaining group identity. NTs find it difficult to communicate directly and have a much higher incidence of lying as compared to persons on the autism spectrum. NT is believed to be genetic in origin. Autopsies have shown that the brain of the neurotypical is typically smaller than that of an autistic individual and may have overdeveloped areas related to social behavior. Kind of funny, but also true. So, why is neurodiversity, cognitive diversity, important in philosophy? The value of it. And here's some, I'm going to explain it and then give some examples. So in my 2010 article, Cognitive Diversity in the Global Academy, Why the Voices of Persons with Cognitive Disabilities Are Vital to Intellectual Diversity, I argue the following. As one aspect of intellectual diversity, cognitive diversity promises novel ways of thinking and new understandings of what knowledge is, who makes it, and how it is made. The unique value of cognitive diversity is its insistence on a radical shift in our conception of who can know and who can produce knowledge. Insisting on the inclusion as scholars of persons with minds labeled disabled, epistemology of disability pushes us to reform the much criticized but still dominant notion of the expert and scholar as able-bodied and hyper-rational. In Woodcock's Disability, Diversity, and the Elimination of Humankind, and Hessius's More Than Merely Rational, Imagining Inquiry for Ability Diversity, There's a clarion call to heed the ways in which attitudes toward disability reflect and reinforce attitudes about knowledge. Both authors argue that the value of disabled persons as knowledge makers is yet to be recognized and safeguarded. Fortunately, this is changing, and a number of excellent articles have been published that demand a rethinking of learning disabilities and a recognition that the persons with them are unique and valuable knowledge generators. How and why should we value the voices of cognitively disabled philosophers? The answer to both questions can be found in the work of feminist standpoint theorists. Feminist standpoint theory is a methodology that insists we begin our scholarly undertakings with the knowledge claims of persons rendered invisible in our discourses. Feminist standpoint theory as it exists today is both a methodology and an epistemology. It argues for and operates under three central claims. 1. There are differences in perception attributable to differences in the concrete lived realities of those doing the perceiving. 2. A standpoint is not the same as a social position. It requires active reflection on the ways in which one's social and intellectual realities work to form a way of seeing the world. And 3. The standpoint of the oppressed and marginalized is usually less false than that of those in positions of power. The first claim can be read as a general call for diversity in philosophy. I wish to extend it to include the lived cognitive realities of perceivers, including the cognitively disabled. To do so requires a willingness on the part of neurotypicals to accept that there is no correct or normal way of perceiving, and that so-called normal perception is often quite erroneous. It also means recognizing that erroneous perception cannot be corrected by the one doing the perceiving and can only be improved through respectful engagement with the knowledge of non-normal perceivers. The second claim explains why it is that once parents of intellectually disabled children began actively reflecting on their experience as parents in relation to their experiences in philosophy, I'm thinking here of Eva Kate, they were able to identify and subsequently challenge the harmful claims that were suddenly glaringly obvious in fields such as moral philosophy. I am not suggesting one needs to be such a parent to see this, but I am suggesting that being engaged in loving relationships with intellectually disabled persons is critical to a less false understanding of the harms they endure. This also explains why Peter Singer has been so incapable of understanding the harms his philosophy rests on and promotes. Again, a great example of this is happening in Kate and Carlson's edited anthology. The third claim of feminist standpoint theory is another one of the reasons why we must include, value, and promote the knowledge of cognitively disabled philosophers. As a marginalized group within philosophy, in particular as marginalized in virtue of what philosophy has traditionally considered its defining characteristic, a non-disordered mind, philosophy cannot move forward in pursuing truth without the knowledge cognitively disabled philosophers generate. I would also point you to a recent article by Leisha Carlson in Philosophical Inquiry in Education, in which she provides an in-depth analysis and account of how and why we should include intellectual disability in the philosophy classroom, including in the form of teachers and students. That's from 2021. Some examples of contributions already made by cognitively disabled philosophers. I now turn to three instances of cognitively disabled philosophers recognizing and explaining what neurotypical philosophers generally do not. In each case, the philosopher has publicly identified as disabled, often in interviews with Shelley in the Dialogues on Disability series. The three examples are Amandine Katala, who I noticed is here, hello, on what's missing in accounts of epistemic injustice, Karl Viertel, which is a pseudonym, on the value of depression for doing philosophy, and myself on the ongoing exclusion of the cognitively disabled in philosophy. When this is later developed into a book chapter, the examples will be more numerous and more broadly representative of the contributions of cognitively disabled philosophers. First, Katala on epistemic injustice. Terrific progress has been made in epistemology in recognizing and accounting for the ways in which the knowledge gained and expressed by certain persons through their lived experience has been discounted because of their lived experience. Some of the best known accounts of this come from philosophers Miranda Fricker, Christy Dotson, Jose Medina, and Gail Polhouse. What none of them have noticed, however, but Katala has, is that this body of literature, quote, excludes people with intellectual disabilities from the scope of epistemic agency and the demands of epistemic justice. This is from a 2020 article. In other words, quote, if people with intellectual disabilities do not qualify as epistemic agents, then any credibility or intelligibility deficit they may face cannot be said to be undue. There cannot be epistemic injustice in this case. I'm confident that this is an unintended harm, but what a harm it is, and a rather ironic one at that. Katala generates a new account of both epistemic agency and epistemic injustice, one that is, quote, inclusive of both people with and people without intellectual disabilities, end quote. My proposal is that Katala's autism contributes to this insight. Katala herself has only identified as autistic in recent years with some hesitation. See her November 2021 Dialogues on Disability interview. So I'm not proposing that she herself asserts this. Instead, I am working at building a body of evidence that being outside the norm neurologically increases the chance and may be a precondition for recognizing ongoing exclusionary practices in regards to cognitive disability in philosophy. Viertel on depression and philosophy. In his interview with Shelley on Dialogues on Disability in March of 2020, a philosopher with significant depression reflects on how well suited depression is to philosophy and vice versa. And I should note that he uses a pseudonym because he says he's too nervous about the kind of discrimination he'll face in the job market if he's public with this, with his own name. In discussing some of the philosophers he loves and the likelihood that they had disabilities, Viertel considers that the kind of alienation he experiences through depression may have been experienced by them as well, as a result of their disabilities. And those include fear of public speaking, stuttering, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. Perhaps, and those are for the philosophers he's mentioning, perhaps, he suggests, this is a quote, these philosophers could only do the work they did because they were at home in the world of ideas, end quote. And this at-homeness resulted in part from their feeling of being alienated from what he calls the realm of the quotidian. In considering his depression, he notes strong similarities between depressive perseveration and philosophical rumination. Being extremely self-critical, also a feature of depression, has arguably made him a better philosopher. Quote, I've been able to hone it into a genuine ability. I've thus been able to pore over the tiniest details in my work, recognize the flaws in them, and fix them. I think I can assess my work better than any peer reviewer can, and this has served me well in my career, end quote. One of my favorite insights from this cognitively disabled philosophers has to do with wonder. Mentioning Plato's claim that this is how philosophy begins, Viertel notes that, quote, we only really wonder if we are somehow dissatisfied with the way things are. If our ordinary descriptions and beliefs and habits are, for whatever reason, inadequate to us, end quote, as they are for the depressive. I find this an incredibly exciting possibility worth further development. Do those with depression engage more thoroughly or more often in wonder? Finally, Viertel argues that the deep uncertainty experienced by the depressive philosopher, quote, fuels a quest for certainty of a rather unique sort, turns philosophy into something more than the play of ideas, end quote. Reflecting on this leads me back to the likes of Peter Singer, for whom arguments about killing the intellectually disabled seem a form of play, and as such he is unwilling to revise them on the basis of the quality of their logic. Would a depressive philosopher be more willing to reconsider an error that causes such obvious harm to others? And then the third example is myself. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about my own story. Like a number of cognitively disabled philosophers, I wasn't diagnosed with my disabilities until I was in a doctoral program, and the way in which it happened is instructive. I've shared my story elsewhere, so I apologize to those of you for whom this is repetitious. I was always a good student and a rule follower, but never the great student I sometimes expected myself to be. As a girl, my frustration was attributed to expecting too much of myself, not to any possible disability. When I entered graduate school as a doctoral student with excellent scores and excellent recommendations, which I highlight because of the contrast with my experience, I struggled more than I ever had. For the first time in my life, I was dropping out of classes or asking for incompletes. I didn't understand why it was suddenly so hard. At the end of my first year, I was required to take my master's comprehensive oral exam on the history of philosophy. They do that at Boston College so that you're officially qualified to teach as an instructor the next year. It was a 1-hour exam on any topic in the history of philosophy. As daunting as this was, I had the rare experience of feeling prepared when the exam started, partly because I declared my philosophy major my first semester as an undergraduate, so I'd been studying it for a long time. To pass required a unanimous vote of the 4 examiners, and I got a 3 out of 4, so I failed. The only option was to take it again and either pass and continue in the program or fail and be kicked out. I did the only thing I could think of doing and went to the tutoring center and asked for help. Not surprisingly, they had no tutors for doctoral students. But that decision has changed my life. Within a few minutes of talking with me, the director of the center suggested I be tested for ADHD at the university's expense, thankfully, and it was based on her observation that I was the most classic case she'd ever seen. It was 1993. I had no idea what ADHD was, but after confirming the diagnosis, I began to study it intensively. Understanding how an ADHD mind can work and what sorts of changes I could make to help me do better at the things I wanted to, like passing oral exams, was invaluable. Nevertheless, I still might have failed out of graduate school, never become a tenured professor or a department chair, were it not for a bit of luck and anti-neurotypicality among my committee members. Wanting to understand why I passed the second time and not the first, one of the professors present at both exams shared this. So this is my recollection. It's not a direct quote. You didn't answer any of our questions. 99% of the time, we ask a question and we either get a right answer or the wrong one. But in your case, neither of those things happened. When we asked you to explain constant conjunction of ideas, you didn't summarize or explain the concept. Instead, you told us about why it was a concern of Hume's and how Hume's account of it dramatically changed the course of philosophy. We decided that although you never answered our questions, you did demonstrate a deep understanding and knowledge of the material, and that this was reason enough to pass you. In fact, she said, it was the most interesting exam I've ever sat in on. How does this story fit into this paper? It shows a number of things, including the pervasiveness of cognitive ableism in philosophy. Think of all the people who weren't given that benefit of the doubt, as well as how easily it can be overcome with the right attitudes in place. Their willingness to recognize an alternative form of knowledge as a legitimate form of knowledge made the difference. It also shows that I do philosophy differently and probably always have. In looking at ADHD literature, there's a lot of discussion of seeing connections where others don't, or being very creative. My own experience confirms this, and the diagnosis gives me a causal explanation that is extremely useful in succeeding at my most challenging tasks. In my most recent interview with Shelley, I talked a lot about internalizing ableism and not really integrating into my life, my diagnosis, particularly into my professional life. I left my job at the end of 2019, partly because I was so completely overwhelmed and drained by it, having only asked for accommodations that spring after realizing how difficult things were getting, and I was turned down for the accommodations. A number of Shelley's interviewees describe a similar difficulty in keeping up with the profession, staying competitive, managing the job of professional philosopher. And I think what pushed me over the edge was being department chair for those 8 years. Clearly, we cannot rely on luck alone to keep us present in the field. The changes needed require rethinking the philosophical enterprise to some degree, as well as institutional level changes to academia. My hope is by arguing successfully for the unique value of having cognitively disabled philosophers in academia, I can provide some motivation to bring such changes about. Conclusion: what comes next? As I've mentioned already, this paper is the beginnings of a book chapter for a handbook of philosophy and disability. My area of focus in philosophy and cognitive disability, and my aim, is not to provide an encyclopedic account of the subfield, of which there are a great and growing number of excellent instances, but to address it critically and from the perspective of a cognitively disabled philosopher. My question for you is, what else would you like to see addressed in such a chapter? What is missing from the literature that needs to be addressed? And if you don't wish to share that now, or if you do and have more thoughts, you can always email me. I should have put this on the slide. It's my first initial and last name, MODONOVAN, and the number 17 at gmail.com. Second, I'd like to end by revisiting a comment made early on in philosophy of disability about the field itself. In providing an overview of philosophy and disability in the year 2000 in the magazine Philosophy Now, Anita Silvers points out that philosophy of disability has not been, quote, spun off as a subspecialty, but instead is being integrated into whatever discussions of central philosophical issues invite challenges to normalizing assumptions, end quote. In the 21 years since, it seems that the spin-off has occurred. My question is, are there unintended but nevertheless significant harms that result from being spun off, such as being less integrated, not more? Or is this a positive development in the field? Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And as a cognitively disabled philosopher myself, I've found a lot of what you said very much resonated with me and my own experiences.
I'm so glad. There's a lot of us in philosophy.
Yeah, quite a few. Let's see if we're getting some questions.
Well, maybe Nathan, I could start off if there aren't any in the Q&A, or I see some are coming. Well, I'll be very quick. So, Maeve, that was really fascinating to hear about your experience as a graduate student in the US. I spent a couple of years in a graduate program in the UK, and then went to the US just for a year. But I was really struck by some of the differences, and how in the US there was a very formal set of requirements that people had to jump through. And at that time in the UK, we were not nearly so rigid in saying, that if you're going to have to teach, you have to pass this exam. It was rather, in those days, you just had to impress the right person, or which may not be a great practice in its own right, of course. And at that time, I regarded the US as a much more professional system, and maybe one in which people did get a better education because they had to go through those hoops. But now I wonder whether professionalism is maybe a form of ableism, and that the UK system did allow people of greater diversity maybe to flourish, not by design, just by accident. But I don't know if you've done anything comparing the US with other countries, and whether there is anything particular to it.
In regards to graduate education?
Yeah, or generally speaking, in terms of formal requirements. So, for example, in the French education system, if you fall off, there's no way back in. You have to do everything right at the right time. Whereas in the UK system, at least as it was, you could take. I did. I went out to work for 3 years before going to university, but that wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, in the French system. The US system, of course, has community college and other ways back in. So I'm just wondering if it's whether it's American, something about the American system, something about academia, something about the US academia together, or any reflections comparatively, I think would be quite interesting to me.
I can't say that I've studied it intensively, but I can give you my initial thoughts. I think in an odd way, I was perhaps luckier to have that 4-person panel because, and as I mentioned, the first time 3 people were okay with it. And in fact, the person who was not okay with it was the Hume person. So that has stuck with me this whole time. Although having unanimous decisions, I think, is a problem. And I think that would be one way to address the issue. I would be worried to rely on just one person. And I know that I went to Boston College, and in my graduate program, a lot of the people who were doing, I shouldn't say interesting philosophy, but philosophy that wasn't as standard, were working all with the same advisor, David Rasmussen. He was one of those people who was ready, even if it wasn't his area, he would connect you with a second reader. And so he approached advising with this great critical humility of what can I do to help you get through, rather than do I agree with your project. So I think that openness that you talk about in the British system is appealing if you have the right person. But my guess is you can run into the same issues in many of these. I do like where certain programs have no longer required logic. And I know that's been really important for people with dyscalculia. And there may be similar things that could be done for people with dyslexia. And I know other programs have absolutely refused to make those kind of changes and said, if you can't study logic, you can't be a philosopher. And I didn't have any trouble with logic, but I don't really use logic in anything that I do. So that certainly seems like something that could be rethought. But it'd be interesting to look into how graduate training is producing or not producing cognitively disabled philosophers. It's a good question.
Next, we have a question from Morgan, who says, the neurodiversity paradigm is currently being appropriated by medical industries and neoliberal business interests, for example, to capitalize on stereotype benefits of, quote, autistic hyperfixation, unquote. How can neurotypical and privileged neurodivergent philosophers avoid appropriating the neurodiversity paradigm when discussing already existing philosophical concepts? Also, why do we choose to refer to cognitively disabled philosophers as opposed to neurodivergent philosophers?
Morgan, that is such a good question. Thank you for that. And I am, very nervous about the way the neurodiversity paradigm is being appropriated in medical industries and, as you said, neoliberal business interests, and just in the public imagination. It certainly contributes to a lot of hostility towards disabled people by suggesting that people have some kind of special skill, and particularly in the case of autism, they're sort of movie representations of this autistic savant, and of course most autistic people do not have what would be considered savant-like capabilities. So I think, how can we avoid appropriating it? I think it's, what I'm trying to do is be careful about looking at how the experience of, and I'll come to the terminology question, the experience of being cognitively disabled while doing philosophy makes you attentive to certain limitations, exclusions, problems, or more likely to notice them. And when I was talking about Ava Kate, and who isn't cognitively disabled, but it was her relationship with her daughter, and I think she described it as a writer's block, that she didn't write about or think about her daughter in terms of her philosophy until she hit a wall. And it was when she began to think about those two things together that something changed. And she has really, I mean, what she and others in her sort of crew have done in making this field what it's becoming is vital. And I don't know if it would have happened without her hating the way that somebody she loved was struggling. So I agree that it needs to be avoided. I try not to mythologize disability. I'm not trying to say there aren't disadvantages. What I am trying to say is that, just along this feminist standpoint method, that if your cognition is different, then your knowledge and the perceptions you have are going to be different. And if we're in a field that wants to pursue truth, that should be highly valued instead of seen as a reason to exclude somebody from participation. The terminology is a problem. I am not sure what the best term is. Neurodivergent has certain appeal, but it also reminds me of, and this is not you, that just one of the reasons I haven't been using it is because sometimes when people refer to someone as neurodivergent, I wonder if they're reducing diversity to a single body, just as we've seen in discussions on racial diversity. If there's a Black person in the department, then everybody says, oh, we're a diverse department. And I don't think that's what diversity is. So that, I think that those are my thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the next question, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name correctly. It's from Lauren Guillemette. It says,
Guillemette, I think, yeah.
Guillemette. She thanks you for your honesty and experiences in the field as a cognitively disabled philosopher, especially concerning questions of attention, to which she relates. She says she'd love to hear you say more about how your artistic practice possibilities forth in your thinking. I loved reading about this in your dialogue earlier this year. How might different modes of expression change? Who can participate in philosophy and how?
Thank you, Lauren. And I'm a little teary because I really exposed myself in that interview. And part of that is because I can now. I've sort of stepped away from the academy a little, and it frees me to be able to say things that I might have been nervous about making public before. But one of the most wonderful things that happens anytime I talk about my own struggles is that someone shares with me that it really was helpful to them, either with their own struggles or with somebody they know and love. So I appreciate the thanks, because that was an unusual interview for me. Yeah, so since I left academia, and of course I timed it really well because they told me there was no way I could teach remotely about 2 months before the pandemic made everybody teach remotely. So I have always loved and had as a hobby drawing. I'm particularly interested in the human body. And I just threw myself into these suddenly available Zoom classes. And at one point, it's interesting, at one point my husband asked me, what's like the deep meaning of the work you're producing? How does it connect to your philosophy? And I had this answer that surprised him, but I said, it's the physicality of it. There's something so refreshing about creating after feeling like I have been part of a field that's so focused on criticizing, and I include myself in that. I can pick apart an argument with the best of them, but it doesn't make me feel good. It doesn't make me happy, I think. And so to be able to create and generate seems wonderful. And my ultimate goal is to get good enough to represent disability in my art, and probably physical disability as well, although that has the danger of becoming a spectacle. But promoting the sort of the variety and wonderful diversity of humanity in all of its forms. And so I've done a little bit with collage, which is where it's come out most. I love building bodies out of very unexpected pieces, and fortunately there's a huge wave of that kind of art being done publicly by some terrific Black artists out there. Shabalala Self, is, I mentioned her in there, she's one of my favorite. So I think it's bringing forth new possibilities. It's certainly grounding me in a way that just doing philosophy wasn't. I think, again, because of the creative aspect. It's also been a source of community, which I taught at a small women's college, and so our department was 3 people. So I had community there, but it was very small, and we weren't well funded, so I wasn't able to travel to conferences a lot. So I didn't have community in that sense with other philosophers. It was more community with other academics. So what's been nice in this is to be working with a group of people on the same goal over and over and over again. I have been with like 40 to 50 women coming and going over the last almost 2 years, and we've had 4 art shows, and we weigh in and critique each other's work, and it's been terrific. Sort of like a symposium of artists. So I probably could say more, but I'm going on. Thank you.
Yeah, our next question is from Kevin Selhai, who asks, wow, thank you so much, especially for the diagnosis of the neurotypical. Are there any specifically good programs where there are allies for the neurodivergent?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. We didn't have grad students, so I wasn't as up on what was happening in different programs as I should have been. What I can say is I have never once recommended anybody go to the grad program I went to. And not only was there not a lot of room at the time for neurodiversity, but it was and continues to be not great around gender and racial equality. And it's a Catholic school, so it encounters some issues around sexual identity as well. I know that my best friend, a philosopher, Desiree Melton, went to SUNY Binghamton and had, not to SUNY, to Binghamton University, and had a terrific experience in terms of mentorship and embracing her as a Black woman in philosophy. She, well, I won't share her story, but she really was supported there. But I think all of these gourmet philosophical gourmet reports and everything, hopefully there's something like that out there. And if not, that's a great thing for my committee at the APA to jump on, is to start putting forth a list of neurodivergent friendly programs. So thank you for that suggestion.
So there's no more questions at the moment. We have another few minutes to ask. Just given your experience and your academic work on the exclusion of cognitively disabled philosophers in the field, what do you feel are the most important sort of concrete steps to take to start addressing this issue, to start increasing the amount of diversity in the field?
Well, I'm always a fan of what I call critical humility. So approaching the world and all of our areas, and philosophers doing this as well, with an understanding of our that we're naturally limited, that any account we give is going to be partial, incomplete, no doubt have a bunch of errors in it. And so we need to have other people present who come from other ways of knowing, ways of thinking, ways of living. And that's rather individualistic as a change. But I do think that that's why I was able to succeed in the ways that I did. And although I didn't ask for accommodations until that last year formally at my university, I had a good enough relationship with the dean that I was able to miss deadlines without being punished for it. So I think that kind of compassion and relationships are important. But I think disabled philosophers coming together as a group, and I do think that's one of the fabulous things that Shelley's dialogues are producing, and these conferences are producing, and the books that are coming out are producing, is really vital as a form of resistance. I do existing in the field, but also it's the same thing with feminist standpoint theory, but just generating knowledge as a community by reflecting on our lived experiences, not just as individuals, but as members of a community that has somewhat of a shared set of experiences. And I think the last thing I would say, and it's something, and I can't remember which of the dialogues on disability interviews it was in, probably was in a few of them, but a number of cognitively disabled philosophers either aren't getting tenure track jobs or are leaving them when they have them. And this is a huge problem. And I think part of it's happening because the kind of work they're doing isn't respected. And so a volume and the existence of the subfield philosophy of disability, the spin-off, is really vital for establishing that and making that legitimate. But I was going to say something else, and I saw Shelley pop up, and I just got distracted. So, hi, Shelley. That's what it was. Tenure requirements. So I served as chair of our promotion and tenure committee at my university. And again, because we're small, I was evaluating pharmacy professors as well as humanities professors and science and social science professors. And the range of what was considered a good amount of scholarship was huge, and the type of scholarship. And I think philosophy has had a pretty narrow idea of what's been accepted. And I'm very happy that the APA put out that statement a few years back on public philosophy, and that it should be included in tenure and promotion decisions, even though it's not quote unquote peer reviewed. I think moves like that, I think talks that people give should really be included, because at least for one of my philosopher friends, she has so much to say and she gives endless numbers of talks, and they're all amazing and terrific, but it's very hard for her, perhaps for disability reasons, to translate that into written work. And so were those talks to be respected at the same level that something published in the Monist was, I think she wouldn't be worried about tenure and promotion the way that she is. So it's just a few thoughts.
No, looks like we're out of time. Thank you again for such a wonderful talk and for such amazing answers.
Thanks, Shelley. Thank you so much.
Hope everyone
Thank
can
you,
join us
Nathan.
again for the next second day of the conference.